Hello biology students, and welcome to our first video of our new ecology unit. So the first topic that we're going to explore in the ecology unit is some intro material, and also we're going to look at how energy is transferred through an ecosystem. So before we get started, we have to really know what ecology is. So ecology basically looks at how different populations interact with one another, and also how they interact with the physical environment. Now, if you remember from the very beginning of the year, a population is defined as members of the same species who are living in an area. So really, we're looking at basically how different species interact with one another and how they also interact with their environment. Some other relevant vocabulary words that are going to be important for this unit that we've seen before are things like the word community, which, if you remember, is all the different populations that live in an area. And also the word ecosystem, because ecosystem and ecology are really closely related. And remember, we define ecosystem as all the living and non-living things in the area. So remember, biotic means a living thing, and abiotic means non-living things. So biotic factors could be any animal or plant or bacteria or fungus, anything that's living in an ecosystem. Where an abiotic factor that a species might interact with might be the weather, the soil, how much it rains, how much water there is, different chemical reactions. Those are all abiotic factors that can influence a population. So to look at some pictures of some of these vocabulary words, you can see if I have a single elk that makes up an individual, a group of elk living together is a population. If I have elks, but also moose and rabbits and grass and beavers and owls and trees, that's a community. Where if we now include things like a river and the weather with those living things, that's an ecosystem. And remember that a group of similar ecosystems is called a biome, and all the biomes on the planet together make up the biosphere. So these are all words we know from earlier in the year, but it's good to have a little bit of a refresher. Okay, so also as a quick review of abiotic and biotic factors, if we look at an environment by itself, an environment is made up of both biotic and abiotic factors, living and non-living things. So if we split this picture up into just the biotic factors, we can see just the things that are living. So birds and grass and fish and trees and shrubs. You'll notice that the water is missing from this picture because this picture is just showing biotic factors. Where if we look at just the abiotic factors, now we're devoid of life. There is nothing living in this picture. We just have things like weather, water, rocks, soil. So that's abiotic and biotic factors. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about energy transfer. So obviously energy is transferred through an ecosystem as one animal eats another animal or plant, right? So if we link all these predation relationships together, we get what's called a food chain. So a food chain shows the flow of energy or food consumption that's moving through an ecosystem. And something important, that an arrow in the food chain always points in the direction of the flow. So for example, if I have a flagfish eating algae, the arrow actually points towards the flagfish because the energy is being transferred from the algae to the flagfish. Students often want to draw the arrow going the other way because they think, hey, the fish is eating the algae, I should draw an arrow in that direction, but really we're drawing the arrows to show the direction of energy flow. So each organism in a food chain is assigned a level that we call a trophic level. So we know some of these. So the algae is at the primary producer level. Whatever eats primary producers are called primary consumers, which we'll see in a little bit. Whatever eats that primary consumer is called the secondary consumer. Whatever eats that secondary consumer is called the tertiary consumer. So each of these levels, each of these names is called a trophic level. Now, food webs, if you take all the food webs in a given ecosystem and show how they are related, that gives you a food web. So you can see here, I have a food web for a given organism. You can see that this orange pathway is showing you the one food chain that we looked at the previous page, but now we've shown all the other food chains in the area as well, and we've linked them together. I want you to notice a few things. We have our producers on the bottom, followed by our primary consumers, followed by our secondary consumers, and finally, if we had a tertiary consumer, they would be on top. And also all of the energy is also pointing in the direction of energy flow. Now, an interesting thing about food webs is if you remove one species, the whole food web will be affected because everything is interrelated. And kind of along those lines, we have this vocabulary word called the keystone species. And what a keystone species is an organism that drastically affects the ecosystem if it's removed because it has a really unique or crucial role. So some examples. There was a situation in Yellowstone National Park where the wolves were removed because they, at the time, they always thought that wolves weren't very safe for humans. And this had a really big impact on the surrounding environment because the deer population exploded because there was no wolves to keep that population in check. And in turn, the deer really ate a large number of the trees and shrubs that were in the area, which reduced habitats for other animals. And there were all these ongoing effects that had a big impact on that environment. Similarly, starfish are also considered to be a keystone species because in their environment, they basically keep the mussel population under control. And if the mussel population is not kept under control, mussels have a tendency to take over an entire area. They're very invasive. Or they're really good at surviving. So basically, by keeping starfish present, starfish keep the mussels in check, and that allows the area to have a very high level of biodiversity. Other species can live in that area too because the mussels aren't taking over. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about trophic levels next. So kind of the lowest trophic level is the producers, which are also called autotrophs. And producers are things that obtain their energy by using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis to take sunlight or chemical energy and to make glucose. So basically, the producers are basically producing all of the glucose that's going to be available to higher trophic levels in the food chain or food webs. And remember that glucose is important because it's used in cellular respiration to make ATP. Heterotrophs are anything that eat other organisms to get their glucose. So we have three main levels. We have primary consumers. This little symbol, 1 with the degree symbol, just stands for primary. And they are defined as consumers that eat producers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, and tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers. Consumers can also be broken down or classified by the kind of organisms they eat. So if a consumer only eats plants, it's called an herbivore. If it only eats animals, it's called the carnivore. And if it can eat both, it's called an omnivore. Another unique type of consumer are consumers that have evolved to get energy from dead organisms and waste. So there are two words you should know here. So scavengers are organisms that get their energy from dead organisms. So maybe vultures and hyenas are considered to be scavengers. So let's look at the hyena example. So usually I want you to imagine you had a lion kill a zebra on the African savanna. Hyenas might come in and eat the remains of that zebra carcass. So they didn't kill the zebra itself, but they scavenged after the fact. That's why they're called scavengers. And then really, really important to an ecosystem are decomposers. And these are things that break down dead organisms. So they break down plants that have died, they break down animals that might have died, and they get energy by this. But more importantly, they also release those nutrients back into the ecosystems that plants can then use to help themselves grow. So decomposers are things like bacteria, fungi, earthworms, all very, very important for a functioning ecosystem. So we've been talking about food chains and food webs and talking about how they show an energy transfer through the ecosystem. So let's talk a little bit more about energy transfer. So each time energy is transferred to a new organism, that energy is first consumed by that organism. It is then used, and then it's transferred to the next trophic level when that organism gets eaten itself. However, it's interestingly, if, a primary consumer ate a plant and received 100 units of energy, they would not be able to transfer all 100 of units of that energy onto the next level. In fact, only about 10% of the energy is actually transferred to the next level. And 90% of it is lost before it can get transferred. Now you might be wondering, okay, where is this energy lost to? Because energy can't really be lost. Part of it is lost as heat. It's used to heat the animal's body, and then it kind of dissipates out into the atmosphere. It might be used to do cellular respiration. And then used for actions in the body, or it might be lost as waste. But only 10% of the energy is actually used to make body tissue, which means only about 10% of that energy gets transferred to the next organism when the organism eats it, because it's only going to be able to get the energy that's stored in body tissue, which makes sense. So this is often depicted in a pyramid. So for example, primary producers, as they absorb energy from the sun, we can say they have 100% energy maybe, but only 10% of that energy gets transferred to the next level because plants use 90% of that energy for heat, for cellular respiration, and as waste. And then only 10% of that 10% gets transferred to the next level, which means the secondary consumers only get 1% of the original 100% of energy. And then they only transfer 10% to the next level, which means the third level consumer only gets 0.1% of that original 100% of energy. So like I said, this is represented in this what's called an energy pyramid, and we only get 10% of the energy to be transferred up to the next level. And why this is important is it basically limits how many levels you could have. Like it's, students often ask me, why aren't there quaternary consumers or, the fifth level consumer? And that's because there's not enough energy, because as it transfers each level, so much is lost. There's not enough energy to support too many trophic levels. Similarly, you can kind of think there are population-wise, there are very few top-level predators. You might have millions of plants, millions of producers in an environment, but you have very few top predators, things like wolves or lions, and that's because there is not enough energy to support a large population of these tertiary consumers. So that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next one.